Hey guys, welcome back from spring break. I hope you guys are all doing okay. This is Heidi, and this week we're going to be starting the last focus of our course, which is JavaScript. Now, before we get into that, let's go over our announcements. Thank you all for submitting the group project. We as staff are going through them and we're going to be grading them really soon. And it's really great to see you guys submit your first full-blown website, and that's really exciting. But be sure to fill out the peer evaluation form if you haven't already. This will help us make sure your projects are graded fairly. We will be releasing weekly homework again, and this will be due on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Like before. If you need extra accommodations or extensions, do feel free to email us. But remember that you do get 2 homework drops. Your 2 lowest scores are automatically dropped, and you can submit late homework up until the end of the semester and get half credit. So just remember that those options are available. We want you guys to start thinking about your final project. And even though this isn't due for like a month, we are going to have a check-in due like you did for the group project. And we just really want you guys to start envisioning what you guys want to make. Because this is really why most of you signed up for this class, because you guys had something in mind that you wanted to do with these new skills. And this is your chance to create whatever you had in mind. So this is super open-ended. It's an individual project, and most people, I wouldn't say there's a most people thing. People do all sorts of things. I'm going to show you guys our project showcase, where we have our top 4 projects from every semester. In the past, our final class would be where the staff select some of our favorite projects and have those people present, and then everyone votes on their top 4 favorite projects. Since our class is all virtual now, I think it's just going to be the staff voting and selecting the top 4, but that's to be decided. But here are some of our top projects from the past semesters. Like this one by Frances. She likes architecture, so she made this little map, and if you click on these pins, you can see the different places that she went to in Tokyo, and this like cool image fading animation. So that was a really nice one from last semester. Some people do more practical sites, like in the semester before that. I think someone made this site to help them with their linguistics homework, and there's some cool like interactive features, which this is done by JavaScript, which you guys are going to learn in the next few weeks. And some people just do like cute personal projects. Like Steven, he used to be a TA actually. He did a photography site because he's really into photography. And there's just these cute little features, and you can like select the color, and then it'll show pictures relevant to that color. So people do a variety of things, and that's why this project spec is so open-ended. The only real requirement is that you have 3 different views, not necessarily 3 pages, but at least 3 very distinct views, and that you have 3 features of some significance, and this is of your own choosing. And we just want you guys to develop like 3 things on your site, like maybe an animation or a certain like cool experimental thing, or like an interactive button or some cool hover effect. And that's just to make sure that your website has some purpose. But other than that, it's just a super open-ended project, and we really want to see your creativity. You'll submit a short write-up, like a very short one that tells us about your 3 features and how you implemented them. And for grading, it's pretty similar to the group project where you do a check-in with a staff member. And since everything is online now, this will be through online office hours, and where you'll show your mock-up and tell us about your features, and we'll give you some feedback before you guys just jump right into it. And you'll be graded on just like very similar things that we've been going over, like the visual user interface design, the overall user experience, and the 3 features of your choosing. As for the timeline, we want you guys to do the project check-in by April 16th. So just go ahead and email a TA or instructor to attend their virtual office hours. I think most people are doing it on Zoom. And then the final project submission will be April 28th, which I think is just like the end of the semester. And just as it was in a group project, you're not allowed to use online resources or pre-made templates or site builders. We really want you guys to use the skills that you learned in this class. The exception, which we'll go more about this in detail later, is JavaScript libraries. And you might not know what that means right now, and that's because we haven't talked about JavaScript yet. But yeah, keep that in mind. Yeah, so this project spec is up on the portal for you guys to review in more detail on your own, but yeah, we just want you guys to start thinking about this. So finally, in our announcements, yeah, office hours, ask us questions on Piazza, and we would love your feedback. I'm still getting used to recording these lectures, so if there's something that you think I really need to improve on, I would love to hear that from you. So we got through HTML and CSS, and now we're on JavaScript. Going through our analogy like before, HTML was like the skeleton of our site, providing that structure for our content. CSS was like the clothes on our skeleton, designing how our site looks like. And finally, JavaScript is going to let us describe how the site should behave and what interactive functionality it'll have. First, I'm going to go over some things like, what is JavaScript? What can we do with it? What does it look like? And clear up everything before we really dive into the actual code. JavaScript is a programming language, and some people might distinguish between a scripting language and a programming language and talk about those technical details, but we're not going to go over that for the purposes of this course. It's different from what we've seen in the course so far. It's different from HTML and CSS. And if you're familiar with programming in Java, it's also pretty different from Java. I want to make a note to say that this like programming, coding, JavaScript, it doesn't have to be scary. Just like we wrote HTML and CSS to tell the browser what we wanted things to look like, now we're going to write JavaScript to tell the browser what we want those things to do. If we were sitting in class right now, I'd probably have you guys raise your hands, but most of you guys are not computer science majors and don't have that programming background. For those of you who are and do have that programming background, you might find today's lecture not as conceptually interesting, but over the next few weeks, we're really going to tie this into how we can use this for web development. JavaScript can do a lot as a programming language. It can basically do anything, but our goal is to write JavaScript code that will add interactivity to our pages. Specifically, JavaScript can change our existing HTML and CSS. So some examples you've definitely seen on the web already are like pop-up dialogues, image carousels. Anytime you see something being like expanded or hidden or changed when you click on it, that's done with JavaScript. I want you guys for the rest of this class to think about interactive functionality like this. When the user clicks on this button or link or image, then add/change/remove this specific HTML or CSS. And I want you guys to always think about what you want to accomplish before you start coding. We've done this workflow throughout the class where you guys start out with like a lo-fi wireframe to a full-fledged mock-up before you start coding your HTML and CSS. And this is the same thought process where you really drill down exactly what you want to accomplish before you start coding. When you're coding, you're really just converting what you're thinking about in English to code to accomplish that on your web page. And here's some examples of what I mean. So let's say I want this feature on my page. When the user clicks on this image, then increase its size. So what does that really mean in code? Well, when we say increase its size, then what we really mean is change its width in CSS. So this is how I really want you guys to think about your features in this structure so that we can break it down and kind of convert it closer and closer to the pieces of code that we'll need to accomplish this task. Another example. When the user clicks on this button, then change the colors to dark mode. Like dark mode is probably a feature that you've seen on a lot of apps and sites. So like this is how we think about it. Change colors to dark mode. What does that actually mean? That means that you want to change the CSS color and background color properties. When the user clicks on this tab, then change the content. So maybe you have a lot of content on your page and you're organizing it into some separate tabs. Like I know for the Kingpin Donuts site, some of you guys wanted to make a more complex menu that had different tabs for different sections of the menu. So how do we think about this feature in terms of code? So changing the content, what that really means is to hide the first div and then show a second div. And what that really means is to set display none to the first div and then set display block to the second div. So you can kind of see how I go from this like high level description of what I want to create, and then slowly you can kind of convert this to now we know exactly what CSS we want to set on the exactly what HTML we want to change. Final example. When the user clicks on the up arrow, then increase the number. And what increase the number means is to take the number that we're currently at, add 1 to the number, and then change the div content to this new number. And so these examples are how I want you guys to think about this. And I know I keep repeating this, but be able to clearly describe what you want to do. When we write HTML, it just shows up when we open the HTML file in a browser. When we write CSS, it shows up if there were CSS selectors that referred to certain HTML elements that were on that HTML page. So what about JavaScript? So for now, it's not just going to show up on the page unless we tell it to modify certain HTML and CSS, and we'll get to that next week. For now, it lives in the console in Chrome DevTools, and I'll show you guys shortly. Alright, so how do we go around to trying this out? So similar to CSS, our JavaScript is going to live in another file, and JavaScript files have a .js extension. And then we're, just like CSS, we kind of have to like tell the browser to go find the file and like kind of add it to our HTML page. And we do this with this script tag. Go script src equals, and then the file path, and then there's a closing tag. And this goes in head, just like when we're linking CSS. Alright, so I'll just show you guys real quick. I made like this empty folder on my desktop, and I'm gonna open Sublime Text, create a new file, save it as script.js, And I'm gonna do this in my new folder. Save. Then I'm gonna make another file, which is going to be my index.html. Save. Okay. And then I'm gonna do my basic HTML tags. And so here in head, I'm going to do a script tag. Can you see okay? Here. I'm gonna do a script tag, and in here it's gonna say src equals, and since the JavaScript file is just in the same folder, the file path would just be script.js. I'm gonna save that. So as you can see, when you open the index.html file, it's completely blank because I haven't put anything in it. And our JavaScript file is also empty, but I just want to show you guys that we're going to be working in the console here. So here you might go here for like your looking at your inspect element stuff. But if you click on this console tab, this is where we're going to do some of our JavaScript demos. And in the homework that's released tonight, it'll also go over the basics of working with JavaScript in this console. This week, the JavaScript concepts we want to get familiar with are just variables, strings, and functions, and two functions called console.log and alert. So today's lecture might seem like it doesn't really connect to web development at all, and that's because we haven't made JavaScript learn to modify the HTML and CSS to really like implement those features. But today's concepts are still really necessary to just get familiar with the very basics of JavaScript, and I promise it'll get a lot more cool next week. First off, variables. Variables in JavaScript are like variables in math. We use a variable when we want to store the value of something and give it a name. So the line of JavaScript code you would write is, for example, let name equals Heidi. And note that we have a semicolon at the end of each line. Just like in CSS, it sometimes, like when you forget a semicolon, then your code doesn't work. Same in JavaScript, so be sure to remember the semicolons at the end of your lines. So the word let here means that we're creating a variable. And then we have the name of the variable, and we usually want our names to be meaningful, like usually a noun, which describes the value that you're saving in the variable. The value that you're storing can be a few different types of things. For example, it can be a number, or we could store text, like in this case, Heidi. But an important note is that if we're storing text, then it must be in quotes. And this is called a string, which is a concept that you might have heard of from other programming languages, or that's okay if not. But yeah, so we will want to use variables really often in JavaScript. For example, if you're making an image carousel, then you might need a variable to store the number for which image that you're currently on. Or later we'll be working with classes and IDs, and you might have to store like the name of the ID of the HTML element that you're referring to. Or like maybe you're doing something with like image pop-ups, and you might need a variable for like the width of the image that you want. So just become familiar with this idea of storing a value in a variable. And I'll just do a demo of this real quick. So I had my Sublime file here. And so earlier I had this empty script file, script.js. So let me just like write the lines that I had in the slide. So let name equals Heidi, let age equal 21. And I'm gonna save. And now I'm gonna go back to my index.html file and refresh. And again, nothing shows up. But So I have the console open, and I want to show you guys how we can use the console to kind of hand in hand help us learn JavaScript. So notice how I have these two variables now, named name and age. So actually, this JavaScript file should be loaded onto this page now, and it kind of lives in the console. So now if I type name, then it tells me name, the value stored in name is Heidi, and age is 21. So how this works is that when we load the page and the browser gets to the script tag, it fetches the JavaScript file, and then it will run your JavaScript code line by line. So the browser will basically run these two lines of code, let name equals Heidi and let age equals 21. So now that they're loaded, they're in the console for us to see. Now, if we were to write code in the console, then it would just be the browser reading the code from there. For example, let's say I say let color equal blue in the console, and I hit enter. And the response is undefined just because there's nothing to respond. We just declared and assigned a variable here. But when I type color, then it tells me color is blue. So, is this too small? I'll zoom in here just so you can get a better view. And this is how we can use the console to kind of help us make sure we know what we're keeping track of. Now that we know about variables, strings, and numbers, we can talk about putting them together. This is called string concatenation, which are just very fancy words for saying putting text together. And remember that when we want to store text in a variable, we always have it in quotes. And this is because we want to distinguish that from like a variable name. Because if Howie is not in quotes here, then JavaScript is going to go looking for like, oh, where do we have a variable named Howie? But in reality, we just want Howie, the words specifically. Anyway, so we have, let's say we have this variable, and then we can make a new variable and actually just add this all together. So howdy in quotes plus name, and notice that name is not in quotes because we want name to refer to this variable, plus exclamation point in quotes. So JavaScript would like go look up what name is, find that it's Howie, and then the result would be howdy Howie. That's stored in greeting. And again, we haven't talked about making JavaScript touch HTML yet, and we will next week. But for now, we're gonna continue using the console. So earlier I just demoed using the console to check what a variable is, and we can also do this with the console.log function. So with this code that we just wrote from the previous slide, if we say console.log greeting, then in the console, this result will show up. And it'll show up right when you load the page, since the browser is gonna like read your JavaScript line by line when it loads the page. So let's see what that's like. So back to Sublime here. I'm gonna change name to Howie, and then I'll have this new line, let greeting equals howdy space plus name plus exclamation point. Then now we want to see what greeting contains. So now we say console.log greeting. Save, and now let's refresh index.html. And now notice that when I refresh, in the console is the result of what is stored in the greeting variable. And notice that it even tells you that this is from line 5 of script.js. Let me make this bigger. Yeah. So notice how in the console here, it says script.js:5. And you can click on that, and the browser will tell you where that console.log statement came from. So that can be useful if you're debugging code, but for now, it might seem like it's not super useful because we're just looking at these simple variables. But in the future, when you're debugging your code and want to know what's going on, console.log is very useful. Just for fun, I'm also going to show you guys the alert function. And alert is just like console.log, but you've probably seen these like annoying pop-ups where the option is, there's like a message and it's just like, okay, this is how they do it. I'm going to go back here and go back to my console. And you know how I said that we now have these variables already loaded into this console, kind of? So like the value in greeting is howdy howie. So now we can call this alert function by saying alert parentheses greeting, hit enter, and here's the result. This pop-up comes up that says howdy howie. And this might be kind of cool, but actually gets kind of annoying. Like, you don't want to bombard your user with pop-ups when they get to your page. So this is usually not used very much. And also, when you do want to make kind of like pop-up boxes, you usually do that with HTML and CSS and using JavaScript to show and hide that. Because with these pop-up boxes, the styling of this depends on the browser and operating system that you're on, and it doesn't allow for much customization. So I'm kind of just showing you guys this for fun, since it's just another feature of JavaScript. With our variables, we can also do basic math. So we have addition, subtraction, multiplication with the asterisk, division with the /, and the percent gets you the remainder. So here's some examples. We can say let age equals 20 plus 5, or age equals 20 minus 2.5. We can use decimal values as well. And note that in this second line here, we're reassigning the value of age, but we don't say the word let again because the variable already exists. So if the variable exists already and you're just changing the value, you can just say age equals instead of let age equals. And then let's say we have a new variable called double age, and we can do age times 2. So this is useful for, again, let's say you're doing like an image pop-up thing where like you click on an image and then the dialog that comes up has like a full-size version of the image. Then maybe you want to like calculate the size of that image or something. Or like, again, with the image carousel example, I keep bringing it up because the image carousel is actually going to be one of our labs in the upcoming weeks, and I think it's a really cool lab that a lot of people actually end up using in their final projects. But when you're doing the image carousel, you'll be like on an image, and then you'll have to calculate like which image comes next and stuff like that. So math is important. Functions are the final concept I'm going to cover in this lecture, and probably also the most important. You can kind of think of them a bit analogous to math if you'd like. A function takes values as input, does something with them, and outputs a value. And this is useful if we have a piece of code that we don't want to keep writing out repeatedly. We can name this block of code instead and reuse it several times. So I'm actually going to show the next slide first for an example. So here I have a function named square, and I want this function to compute the square of a number. So this part defines the function. It says that its name is square, it takes in one parameter as the input, and it outputs a value, which is x times x, which is the square. And yeah, in these curly braces is the code that's going to run if I call this function. So now if you look at these two lines below, is where I'm calling the function. So I say let y equal square of 5, square parentheses 5. And so now the value stored in y is 25, 5 times 5. And then here I say let z equal square of y. And so now you can see that the variable can be the function input. And now this is the equivalent of saying square of 25, which I don't actually know off the top of my head. So this is an example of defining the function and then using the function. Note that these are two different aspects. So this first part just defines the function and says what it is, but it doesn't actually use it. The code, so here, like, no number is squared here yet. No number is squared until you actually call the function, where you say the name of the function, parentheses, and the input parameter that you want to give. So that's how functions work. Let me go back to the previous slide here on how to define a function. So first you say the word function. That means that we're defining a function. You give it a name, and we want names to be meaningful. So this is usually a verb that describes what the code in the function will do. Then we have parentheses, and then we say the parameters that the function takes. And we also name these parameters, like variable names. So in this case, I want this function to take one parameter, and I'm going to name it x. Since I'm kind of going along this math analogy, this is kind of like a f of x type of thing. Then we have curly braces, kind of like in CSS. The curly braces kind of like define a block. And usually we like to indent the lines of code in curly braces, also similar to CSS, and this just helps keep our code really organized looking. So inside the curly braces are the lines of code that will run when you call the function. So the lines of code usually do something with the input parameters. So in this case, I want to do my operation on x. So x times x. And this return keyword, when I have this line of code that starts with return, this means that this is the final output value. So when I say return x times x, I'm saying that like the output of this function is the square of x. And so back to this example, the value of y is whatever is returned in this function. So if we didn't have this return result line, then actually there would be nothing stored in y. But we have this return keyword, and that says spit out the result variable. And then the value of the result variable is 25. So then the value of y is 25. So that was a bit much. Let me just show you guys in a demo. So I'll go back to my script.js file, and I'm just going to clear this, and I'll say, let me just do the square function. So function square. And so the parameter name can be anything. I'll call it like num for number. And then I have my curly braces, and now I have the code that I want to go inside. So the purpose of this function is to square a number. So I'll do let squared number equals num times num, semicolon. And so this just, and then I want to output a value, return squared number. So this is just the function definition. So I'll save and refresh, and nothing happens. the only thing that is loaded in the console now is this function that we can actually call now. So this is a function definition, and now we're actually going to call the function by saying square of, let's say, 25. And the result is 625. And we can also call this function in here. So let's say let y equals square of 22. And then I'll say console.log y. Refresh, and here's our result. And we can also do more different examples here. I know math can get a bit boring sometimes. We can go back to like the little alert function that I mentioned before. So let's say I want to say like function show greeting, and then and it'll take one parameter and it'll be the name. And then I'll say like greeting equals hello plus name plus exclamation. And then I'll say alert greeting. Okay, so a few things to note here. In this function that I just wrote, I'm going to get rid of this. In this function that I just wrote, there's no return statement. There's no line of code that says return. So actually, if I did like, let x equals show greeting of any name, like Miles, he was an instructor last semester. Anyway, so nothing is stored in x. No value is stored in x because this function does not have a return line of code at the end. So there's no output value. But this function is still useful for showing the greeting. So I'll save, refresh, and there's our little pop-up dialog with our greeting. And the whole power of functions is that you can keep calling them, but with different parameters. So I say, so with all these, I'm putting all these different names as the parameter, and then I don't have to repeat this line of code so many times. All I have to do is call the function show greeting. So I'll save, refresh, and here's hello Miles, hello Heidi, hello Diana, hello Howie. So hopefully that gives you a taste of how we can use functions to structure our code. Okay, just a quick final note. JavaScript also has comments, just like HTML and CSS. To write a single line comment, do 2 forward slashes, and then you can write your comment there, and that's completely ignored in your file. Or if you want to do a multiple line comment, then do slash asterisk, and then end with an asterisk slash. And this is useful, just like in HTML, CSS, it's really useful to describe what your code is doing to make a note to yourself and also make your code more readable for other people. So yeah. I know this was a lot for one lecture, so if you have any questions, definitely post on Piazza or let us know, and hopefully you'll get more comfortable with JavaScript through the homework and lab. And this is today's attendance word, which you probably already saw in the slides. Good job if you actually made it through this whole video. I would say that the most important parts of this lecture were the part about how to think of interactive functions, and about how we're kind of converting English to code, knowing the difference between a variable name and a string, and how to use functions. I would say those are the most important parts of this lecture. Great, thanks guys.